The room went silent. My father's voice still echoes in my ears, cutting through the chatter. "You've embarrassed this family." I froze, my hands shaking around the champagne glass. All eyes were on me. Then, the unexpected. A sharp, formal salute. A 4-star general, a guest I barely knew, paused mid-step and nodded at me. The effect was immediate. The chatter stopped. My father's scowl faltered. "Before I tell you how we got here, let me start from the beginning. I grew up in a house where silence was just as loud as words, and the loudest voice always set the rules. My father was that voice. He carried an authority that felt absolute, and it wasn't the kind you could challenge without consequences. From a young age, I learned that mistakes were magnified, successes were minimized, and appearances mattered more than feelings. Our family operated on a hierarchy that seemed invisible to outsiders. My father at the top, my mother quietly navigating the tensions, my sister and I trying to find our footing somewhere beneath him. Respect was a currency measured by fear, and there was very little room for genuine affection. Compliments were rare, almost suspicious, and criticism was constant. The rule was simple: if you didn't follow his expectations perfectly, you would be corrected, publicly if necessary. I was the eldest, the one who bore the brunt of scrutiny quietly, learning early to make myself small so that the spotlight would pass me by. My sister, younger by 3 years, seemed almost immune to his harshness in some ways, perhaps because she had mastered the art of charm and selective compliance. Our mother tried to maintain a buffer, often whispering encouragements in the kitchen or helping us smooth over moments after the storm had passed. But she rarely confronted my father directly. The atmosphere in our house was a constant negotiation between assertion and invisibility, and the lesson was clear: don't provoke, don't rise too high, and never ever show your emotions too openly. Yet, despite all of this, there were flashes of warmth and normalcy, fleeting moments that showed us another way of being. A laugh shared over a movie, a quiet breakfast when no one criticized my choice of cereal, or a gentle smile when we achieved something small. Those moments felt like glimpses into a world where family could be supportive, encouraging, and even kind. They made the strict rules feel heavier, because we knew what we were missing. I remember early on being taught to anticipate my father's moods, to navigate his presence carefully, almost like walking through a room full of fragile glass. His approval was elusive, and his disapproval was sharp, lingering longer than necessary. There were occasions when friends or relatives visited, and I would watch the contrast between how he interacted with them and how he interacted with us. To outsiders, he was charming, witty, and in control, but at home, the charm never reached us. His humor could cut deeper than any criticism, often delivered with a smirk or a raised eyebrow that left no room for rebuttal. I internalized a constant self-monitoring, a slight misstep in tone, a hesitation in my speech, or a posture he didn't approve of could trigger a lecture or a snide comment. Over time, this vigilance became second nature. I learned to anticipate conflict before it arrived, to retreat preemptively, and to perform what I called acceptable behavior, like an actor on a stage. School and friends provided temporary relief, a place where my father's voice didn't dominate, but the anxiety always followed me home. Holidays, birthdays, and especially weddings were amplified stages. These were events where family gathered, where eyes were watching, and where my father could assert his presence for maximum effect. I learned to blend into the background, to smile when appropriate, to nod and agree, to never draw attention to myself unless absolutely necessary. My sister's wedding was approaching, and even though it was her day, I knew that my father would see it as an opportunity to display his dominance, to enforce the unspoken rules of our household in front of a crowd. It wasn't just about embarrassing me, it was about reaffirming the hierarchy. I spent weeks mentally rehearsing how to navigate the event, imagining the situations that could arise, and preparing myself to stay calm under scrutiny. My mother offered quiet reassurances, reminding me that this was about my sister, not him. But even her words were tinged with a caution I couldn't ignore. I knew the patterns all too well. His moods, his triggers, his satisfaction in making someone else small to assert control. And yet, there was a part of me that longed to see him falter, to witness a moment when his authority would meet resistance, even if only silently. As a child, I had dreams of standing up to him, of asserting my worth in ways I never could. but those dreams were tempered by the reality of our family dynamics. I knew that any misstep could result in humiliation, ridicule, or isolation. Even as I approached adulthood, that fear lingered, an invisible tether to his approval. The family system was rigid, a network of roles and expectations that left little room for individuality. My sister's role was that of the charming, compliant daughter. My mother the quiet mediator. My father the enforcer of rules, and I was the dutiful observer, learning the limits of expression, memorizing the social choreography that kept the household from collapsing. It was within this context that I understood my place, the unspoken rules of engagement, and the invisible walls I was not meant to cross. Yet, even within this restrictive environment, there were seeds of defiance, small acts of self-assertion, hidden in notes I wrote to myself, in subtle decisions about how I carried myself, in moments of quiet observation where I considered what life could look like beyond these walls. Those seeds would grow, slowly, imperceptibly, until the moment when they would intersect with my father's behavior at my sister's wedding. It was a delicate balance, knowing when to conform, when to observe, and when to allow a tiny fragment of my own dignity to assert itself. And it was within this tension that the events of that day were born, a collision between a lifetime of expectation and the opportunity for recognition, a stage set not just for celebration, but for reckoning. The tension began to build the moment I stepped into the wedding rehearsal, a subtle shift in the air that told me my father was already in control, already setting the tone for the day. I could feel the weight of his presence before he even spoke, a kind of gravitational pull that demanded attention and respect, even when it was undeserved. At first, it was almost imperceptible, a raised eyebrow as I carried the flowers down the aisle, a smirk when I mispronounced a name in rehearsal, the quiet muttering under his breath that I caught only because my ears had become attuned to every inflection, every nuance in his voice. Each gesture, each glance, was a probe, a test to see how I would respond. I remembered my mother subtly stepping between us at one point, her hands lightly resting on my arm as if to steady me, though she didn't intervene verbally. It was her way of acknowledging the tension without inflaming it, a silent code we had learned over years of navigating his moods. My sister noticed too, and I saw her glance at him with discomfort, a fleeting expression that told me she understood, even if she felt powerless to stop it. The first overt boundary crossing happened when he leaned close during a brief pause in rehearsal, lowering his voice so that only I could hear him, and made a comment about how I always managed to draw attention in the wrong ways, the words dripping with disdain, the tone so carefully calibrated that it felt like a public reprimand even though few could hear it. That moment set the stage for the day, and I realized then that this wedding meant to celebrate my sister would become another arena for him to assert control, to demonstrate dominance, to remind me of my place. As the hours passed, the warnings multiplied. At the family dinner the night before the wedding, he made a casual remark about my career, framed as concern, but it was laced with ridicule. My choices, my efforts, my successes, all of them were subject to his appraisal, and in that room, in front of extended family, the sting of embarrassment was amplified. Each slight was carefully calculated, as if he were building a narrative where I was the character to be publicly corrected, and he, the arbiter of propriety. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, a combination of anticipation, dread, and a simmering awareness that my usual strategies, retreat, quiet compliance, might not suffice this time. During the wedding morning, small incidents accumulated, each one a subtle escalation. He repositioned decorations to improve the visual flow, though it seemed targeted, as if to highlight my earlier efforts and suggest they were inadequate. He commented on my posture while walking down a corridor, on the way I carried a small bouquet, on the slight smile I allowed myself when greeting guests. All of these observations were framed as helpful suggestions, but the weight behind them carried judgment, a reminder that my every move was under scrutiny. I became acutely aware of the temperature in the room, the sound of chairs scraping lightly on the floor, the faint scent of flowers that seemed almost overwhelming in the tense atmosphere, the low hum of conversation that could vanish in an instant with his raised voice. These sensory details, usually background, became indicators of the potential for escalation, signals I monitored like a soldier on alert. By midday, the subtle warnings had evolved into more overt challenges. He made a pointed comment about my sister's choice in music, then quickly pivoted to me, suggesting I might have handled things differently had I been in charge. Laughter followed, not at the joke itself, but at the implication that I was incompetent, and my pulse quickened as I forced a polite smile. At this point, I began noticing the patterns in his behavior more clearly. The way he set traps disguised as advice, how he leveraged humor to veil criticism, and the way his timing ensured maximum exposure to the guests. Every insult, every correction, was layered with intention, creating a landscape where my confidence was eroded without a single overt confrontation. I started to document discreetly, jotting mental notes and making subtle recordings when possible, instinctively preparing a proof ladder should the situation spiral further, a safety net I wasn't sure I'd need but could no longer ignore. The open loops kept multiplying in my mind. Would he escalate in front of the officiant? Would a guest intervene? Could I maintain composure without visibly breaking? These questions swirled as I moved through the day, navigating interactions with a careful precision I hadn't needed to exercise in years. Each step a calculation to preserve dignity in the face of inevitable scrutiny. And then there were moments of quiet rebellion, almost imperceptible, when I allowed myself a subtle assertion, a firm stance when carrying the bouquet, a controlled tone when responding to a minor comment. But each of these was a risk, each a gamble that could either preserve a fragment of my autonomy or provoke a full-scale confrontation. Even my sister, acutely aware of the tension, gave me small nods of encouragement, subtle affirmations that I wasn't alone, that someone recognized the unfairness of the situation. By the time the ceremony approached, the pattern was clear. My father's behavior had escalated from subtle jabs to sustained psychological pressure. Guests were starting to notice the tension, though few understood its origins. I felt like I was walking a tightrope over a crowd, balancing the desire to remain dignified with the instinctual need to protect myself from humiliation. Each step, each interaction, carried stakes that felt far larger than the wedding itself, as if the outcome of this day would somehow define my place in the family forever. I realized that the rehearsal and early hours had been training for the climax to come, a public assertion of his dominance, a test of my ability to maintain composure under scrutiny, and the first real challenge to the boundaries I had spent my life trying to uphold. It was a day poised on the edge of inevitability, a slow crescendo of tension, every moment a microcosm of the family dynamic I had known since childhood. Every glance, every whisper, every forced smile a reminder that, in this household, the loudest voice ruled, and mine had yet to find its place. By the time the reception began, the subtle jabs and psychological tests my father had been administering all day had grown into full-scale public pressure, and I felt the walls of the room closing in with every glance, every whispered comment, every casual but pointed remark he made. It started in small, almost imperceptible ways. A comment about my choice of suit, delivered just loudly enough for nearby relatives to hear. A remark about how I always seemed so serious, while everyone else appeared lighter. A joke that landed in awkward laughter, but cut sharply beneath the surface. I tried to keep my composure, moving deliberately through the crowd, nodding at acquaintances, smiling politely at distant cousins, but each interaction became a minefield where I could misstep and provide him with another public opportunity to assert dominance. The first real escalation happened at the buffet line, where he approached me with a faux casualness, leaning close so only I could hear, and began recounting mistakes from the past in front of other guests, framing them as anecdotes, but clearly designed to embarrass me. I felt my chest tighten, my stomach twist, and a sharp awareness of everyone's eyes on me, even if they didn't fully grasp the context. At that moment, I reached for my phone in my pocket, not to respond, but to begin documenting, building a trail that might serve as validation later, a record of behavior that was no longer subtle or isolated. I started taking discrete photos, jotting mental notes of times and details, recording snippets when I could without drawing attention, each small act of documentation, a tiny act of resistance. The room smelled faintly of flowers and food, and the clinking of glasses and low hum of conversation became almost oppressive as I navigated the social minefield, hyper-aware of every sound, every movement, every shift in attention. As the evening progressed, the pressure intensified. He questioned my choices to my relatives, implying I had mishandled past responsibilities, and he did it with a charm that made it difficult for anyone to challenge him directly. Friends and extended family exchanged glances, sensing the tension, but none intervened, leaving me alone with the weight of the confrontation. It was clear that he was leveraging not only his authority, but also the social norms of the setting. Weddings are supposed to be joyous, celebratory, and conflict-free, to magnify the impact of his comments. I felt cornered, yet I refused to respond with anger. My goal became maintaining composure, while quietly accumulating proof. Every comment logged mentally, every interaction noted for later reference. By mid-reception, the situation had escalated to the point where his behavior was no longer just irritating, it was oppressive, a sustained campaign of humiliation disguised as humor, advice, or concern. A family friend noticed my discomfort and approached, whispering reassurance, which was the first external validation I had received all day, and it reminded me that I wasn't imagining the intensity of what I was experiencing. Encouraged, I began to document more deliberately, capturing video clips when possible, discreetly recording conversations, saving text messages and notes that corroborated my experiences. I was constructing a ladder of proof, alerts in the moment, physical traces of his behavior, digital documentation, and witness confirmation. The open loop in my mind persisted. If this continued, what would the culmination look like? Would he escalate further in front of the entire wedding party? Could I maintain my composure under the mounting scrutiny? Each question added weight, a subtle tension that accompanied every smile I forced, every nod I offered, every conversation I navigated. I felt my own boundaries being tested constantly, the line between tolerance and silent rebellion becoming increasingly blurred. There were moments when I allowed myself small victories, holding my posture, responding with calm clarity to a pointed question, not letting his words dictate my mood, but each was a risk, a calculated act of resistance that could provoke further escalation. My sister, observing quietly from across the room, gave small nods of solidarity, subtle gestures that reminded me I wasn't entirely isolated, that someone understood the unfairness of the dynamics at play. As the evening moved forward, the cumulative effect of the documented incidents began to coalesce into something tangible. A recognition that this wasn't just a single moment of humiliation, but a pattern, and patterns can be confronted with evidence. By this point, guests were beginning to sense the tension, though few could articulate why the air felt charged, why a casual comment could feel like an accusation, why a simple smile could seem defiant. I moved carefully, every gesture deliberate, every response measured, navigating the line between self-preservation and assertion. The sensory details heightened the experience. The low hum of the band, the soft clinking of glasses, the lingering scent of candles and flowers, all framing a theater of tension that felt almost cinematic in its intensity. I found myself mentally rehearsing potential confrontations, preparing how I would respond if the escalation reached its peak, visualizing the room, the guests, the reactions, the possible outcomes. Each mental rehearsal added clarity, a sense of control in an otherwise unpredictable environment. And then, just as I thought the night had reached a plateau, he made a remark that crossed the final threshold, a pointed criticism of my achievements, delivered publicly with a smile that suggested everyone should share in his judgment. The room's ambient noise seemed to dull for a heartbeat as I absorbed the words, the humiliation palpable, the tension thick enough to taste. That was the moment I realized that my documentation, my careful preparation, and my quiet resolve were no longer optional. They were essential. I continued recording discreetly, capturing evidence, mentally noting witnesses, storing each detail in memory, readying myself for the moment when escalation would culminate, and I could finally assert a boundary. The day had transformed from a celebration into a battlefield of subtle power, and I was acutely aware that how I responded in the coming moments would define not only my experience of the evening, but also the credibility of the proof I had amassed, the validation I sought, and the social and personal boundaries I needed to establish. Every glance, every whisper, every step he took seemed to be calculated to provoke, to dominate, to humiliate, and I responded not with anger, but with precision, patience, and quiet determination, aware that the climax was approaching, and that every moment of escalation was building toward a public turning point I could not yet fully see, but could feel coming. The moment arrived during the wedding ceremony itself, the culmination of hours of tension that had been building like a storm on the horizon, and I could feel it in every muscle, every breath, every flicker of light across the polished floors of the hall. My father's voice, which had been steadily rising in both volume and sharpness throughout the day, found its crescendo when he leaned across the pews and addressed me directly, loud enough for several nearby guests to hear, delivering a tirade disguised as advice, each sentence a carefully crafted dagger designed to humiliate, to assert dominance, to remind everyone present of the hierarchy he had enforced for decades. The words were familiar: accusations about my supposed failures, commentary on my choices, insinuations about my character, but they landed with the amplified intensity of a public spectacle, a performance meant to draw eyes, to force me into discomfort. I could feel the tension in the room shift as the sound of his voice carried, mingling with the faint rustle of fabric, the low hum of conversation that had not yet fully quieted, the occasional metallic clink of cutlery left on tables unattended. Guests began to turn toward us, eyebrows raised, some leaning forward, sensing that something unusual was unfolding, though they could not yet articulate what. My pulse quickened, my hands felt clammy, and a part of me wanted to shrink back, to escape the oppressive weight of his attention. But years of quiet preparation, of documentation, of building an internal ladder of proof, held me steady. Then I saw it. Movement from the side of the room, a figure entering the periphery of my vision with unmistakable presence, upright and deliberate, uniform crisp, and insignia gleaming under the soft lighting of the hall. It was a 4-star general, someone I barely knew, someone who carried an aura of authority that needed no words, whose very posture commanded respect. He approached with measured steps, each footfall precise, until he stopped directly opposite my father and me. The room seemed to respond in a collective breath, a subtle hush, as if the energy itself recognized the significance of the moment. My father paused mid-sentence, his scowl faltering as his eyes met the general's, and the weight of an external, unquestionable authority hung in the air. Then, deliberately, the general raised his hand and executed a crisp, formal salute in my direction, a silent acknowledgement that spoke volumes: recognition, validation, respect. The effect was immediate. The chatter, the shifting of chairs, the faint background music, all of it seemed to vanish into a vacuum of attention. Guests froze, some leaning forward, some simply staring, unsure how to process the abrupt change in dynamics. My father's words, so carefully calibrated, stumbled in the air. His mouth opened, closed, opened again, and the power he wielded so effortlessly throughout the day dissipated in the face of the silent authority of someone who had no reason to intervene except for principle. The salute wasn't loud. It wasn't performative in a dramatic sense. It was precise, disciplined, impossible to ignore, and yet understated, a quiet act of recognition that reverberated with impact. In that moment, the entire social balance shifted. I felt a strange calm wash over me, a sense of vindication, tempered by the awareness that dignity had been restored not through confrontation, but through quiet acknowledgement. I could hear the subtle sound of breaths being held, the faint scrape of shoes against the polished floor, the whispered murmur of realization spreading among guests as they registered the reversal of authority. Some of my relatives looked at each other, unsure how to interpret what had just occurred, and my sister's eyes glistened with a mixture of relief and admiration, a silent thank you conveyed without words. My father, confronted by a presence he could not dominate, stepped back, his hands tightening momentarily at his sides, the scowl replaced with a hesitant frown, an unfamiliar vulnerability appearing in his expression. The open loop that had haunted me all day, the question of whether someone would recognize the injustice, whether anyone would stand for me, closed in an instant, and yet the moment was far from theatrical. It was grounded, real, and measured, the kind of validation that leaves a lasting impression without drama. After the salute, the general offered a single, calm sentence, quiet but firm: "I see you." Those words, unembellished yet powerful, cut through the lingering tension like a blade through fog, confirming in a way that no argument or protest could have, that my presence, my dignity, and my worth were recognized. The room remained quiet for a heartbeat. Then slowly, murmurs began, subtle acknowledgments from guests, heads turning toward my father, a silent appraisal of the shift in dynamics, an understanding that the balance of authority had altered, however temporarily. My father's attempts to continue his criticisms faltered, his words clipped and unconvincing, and for the first time that day, I felt an internal alignment, a recognition that control had been restored, not to him, but to me, in the form of silent, undeniable acknowledgement from someone whose respect mattered in its own right. The sensory details, the glow of overhead lighting reflecting off polished floors, the faint scent of flowers mingling with the crispness of the general's uniform, the soft rustle of fabric and quiet clinks of glasses became a backdrop to the unfolding social reversal, an almost cinematic framing of an intimate yet public vindication. Even the guests who had not understood the specifics of our family dynamic could feel the tension resolve in real time, the atmosphere shifting from unease to subtle awe, a collective recalibration of social energy that favored quiet dignity over loud intimidation. I felt a mixture of relief, gratitude, and quiet pride, the culmination of years of restraint, preparation, and patience, crystallizing in a single, fleeting, yet indelible moment. And as the general stepped back, allowing the ceremony to proceed, I realized that the escalation I had navigated, the documentation I had compiled, the composure I had maintained, and the internal fortitude I had cultivated, had all converged to create a public turning point that could never be erased, a moment that redefined boundaries without confrontation, that asserted recognition, respect, and quiet authority in the most profound way. In the days and weeks following my sister's wedding, the ripples of that pivotal moment, the salute, the acknowledgement, the quiet reversal of authority, began to manifest in more concrete ways, and I started to notice subtle but meaningful shifts in the family dynamic that had long been dictated by my father's dominance. The first sign was a series of private conversations with relatives who had been at the wedding, small acknowledgments of what they had witnessed, expressions of surprise and quiet support that confirmed the reality I had felt in that moment. The shift wasn't an illusion, and my dignity had been noticed by others, outside the confines of my own internal validation. My sister, already protective, became more assertive in reinforcing boundaries, gently but firmly redirecting interactions and comments from my father when he attempted to resume his previous patterns. Even my mother, who had long preferred to mediate silently, began to offer explicit support for my personal autonomy, recognizing that the quiet endurance she had tolerated for so long could now be replaced with healthy reinforcement of limits. The first formal acknowledgement came in the form of family discussions mediated by my sister and a few close relatives, conversations that, while calm and measured, carried the weight of consequence. Certain behaviors that had been tolerated or dismissed were now being called out and addressed, and the documentation I had gathered over the course of the wedding, notes, discreet recordings, and corroborating accounts, became an unspoken anchor in these discussions, giving my words weight without me having to raise my voice. My father, confronted with this subtle but undeniable shift, could no longer rely solely on fear or intimidation. His attempts at criticism were now met with quiet resistance, gentle redirection, or polite but firm acknowledgement that certain lines would not be crossed. Over time, I noticed that invitations to family events began to carry an implicit recognition of boundaries, a tacit understanding that my autonomy would not be undermined in the way it had been previously. While he occasionally tested the limits, as old patterns die slowly, the room for his unchecked influence had shrunk, constrained not by confrontation, but by the combination of social validation, documented proof, and consistent calm assertion of my own space. There were also more tangible outcomes, subtle yet meaningful shifts that reinforced the sense of official consequence. There were also more tangible outcomes, subtle yet meaningful shifts that reinforced the sense of official consequence. There were also more tangible outcomes, subtle yet meaningful shifts that reinforced the sense of official consequence. There were also more tangible outcomes, subtle yet meaningful shifts that reinforced the sense of official consequence. There were also more tangible outcomes, subtle yet meaningful shifts that reinforced the sense of official consequence. There were also more tangible outcomes, subtle yet meaningful shifts that reinforced the sense of official consequence. There were also more tangible outcomes, subtle yet meaningful shifts that reinforced the sense of official consequence. There were also more tangible outcomes, subtle yet meaningful shifts that reinforced the sense of official consequence. There were also more tangible outcomes, subtle yet meaningful shifts that reinforced the sense of official consequence. There were also more tangible outcomes, subtle yet meaningful shifts that reinforced the sense of official consequence. There were also more tangible outcomes, subtle yet meaningful shifts that reinforced the sense of official consequence. There were also more tangible outcomes, subtle yet meaningful shifts that reinforced the sense of official consequence. There were also more tangible outcomes, subtle yet meaningful shifts that reinforced the sense of official consequence. There were also more tangible outcomes, subtle yet meaningful shifts that reinforced the sense of official consequence. There were also more tangible outcomes, subtle yet meaningful shifts that reinforced the sense of official consequence. Conversations that had previously ended with dismissal were now treated seriously. Minor disputes that might have once been leveraged against me were now diffused through the presence of witnesses or external authority. And the awareness that my experience was recognized outside of my own perception provided a profound sense of relief and legitimacy. Professionally, personally, socially, the ripple effects extended beyond the immediate family. The confidence I had cultivated in navigating the wedding's escalation carried over into interactions with friends, colleagues, and community members, reinforcing my ability to maintain composure under scrutiny, to assert boundaries without aggression, and to recognize that quiet persistence and documentation could be more effective than confrontation or retaliation. Emotional closure began to take shape as well, though it was neither instantaneous nor dramatic. It was subtle, a gradual internal shift from anxiety and hypervigilance to measured confidence, a sense that I could occupy my space with dignity regardless of external attempts to diminish me. I noticed it in small moments. The ease of greeting family without bracing for critique. The ability to engage in conversation without mentally preparing for a verbal attack. The calm recognition that respect was now a negotiation, rather than a one-sided decree. Even when my father made minor jabs, they no longer carried the same weight. They were acknowledged, assessed, and allowed to pass, without the crushing impact they once had. The open loops that had occupied my mind for years, the fear of public humiliation, the question of whether anyone would stand for me, the anxiety about being dismissed or minimized, gradually closed as I realized that the boundaries I had quietly asserted were recognized not only by myself, but by others whose validation mattered, and that my presence in family events could exist without compromising my dignity. The quiet victories became cumulative, layering over one another to create a new framework for interaction, one where respect was measured not by fear, but by acknowledgement, not by humiliation, but by recognition, not by control, but by clear limits. It was in this period that I truly understood the power of restraint, documentation, and calm assertion. I had not sought revenge, dramatic confrontation, or public shaming. Those were never my tools. But I had prepared, observed, and acted with foresight. And the result was a sustained and meaningful shift in both perception and reality. I began to recognize that this quiet win, this reclamation of personal boundaries, was perhaps more profound than any dramatic confrontation could have been, because it was durable, rooted in reality, witnessed and respected. Over time, the family dynamic settled into a new pattern. My father's authority was no longer absolute, my voice carried weight, my presence was acknowledged with consideration, and my sense of self was reinforced by both internal confidence and external validation. I realized that the real payoff of the wedding, the salute, and the events that followed was not a single moment of triumph, but the enduring establishment of personal boundaries, the creation of a documented and recognized history that supported my dignity, and the emotional closure that comes from knowing that one can assert oneself without aggression, without escalation, and without sacrificing integrity. The culmination of this process was a quiet, steady sense of ownership over my life, my choices, and my presence in family spaces. A recognition that courage need not be loud, that accountability need not be enforced through theatrics, and that boundaries, once clearly set and consistently maintained, can shift long-standing dynamics in ways that are profound, enduring, and deeply satisfying.